I remember when my children were learning to walk. Think about, as parents, those of you in here who are parents or grandparents, think back to when your children were learning to walk. What were the emotions going through your mind? There was some excitement, right? Hey, this is a cool new kind of chapter in the life of my child. So there's a bit of excitement that's building up there. And with the first one in particular, you're like, yeah, come on, let's go. Get up and walk and then run. And then you quickly realize, hey, I got to keep up with this little person. And you immediately discover just how very dangerous your house is. You realize how many plugs you have in your house. You didn't know that you had 50,000 plugs in your house, but you do. And every single one of them's got to be covered up. You didn't realize how many glass things you had out within reach of your little child, but you quickly come to realize that as the first one gets broken. And then you scour the house, going through everything. You look under your bed to make sure that there's nothing there that they can grab. Having a child that walks changes you. It's exciting. And also not very exciting all at the same time. And it was funny to me how you're so proud when your child walks, right? No matter what age they are, right? No matter how long it took them, no matter how quick it was. I know for our children, they were always a little bit late bloomers at walking, right? And so what was humorous to me was upon telling people, you share with them, oh yeah, it took our child 13 months to walk, 14 months to walk, 15 months to walk, whatever it is. And they go, oh, my child learned when they were 9 months old. As though there's some kind of competition, right? As though a child learning to walk quicker than yours, their child learning to walk quicker than yours, is somehow going to make them some superhuman person that your child can never live up to, right? It's weird the ways that we measure ourselves against each other. The walking phase is really fun. But again, it's also very challenging and it's very worrying, right? I thought about how God must look at us, must think about us in our walking phase. As we continue on our spiritual journey, as we begin and continue on our spiritual journey, what are the ways in which God views us and looks down at us, His children? Submitting your life to God is the best decision you can make, right? We all know that. We all believe that. But we also all know that that's when the real spiritual battle begins. That's when we know the real battle with evil commences. We got a lot of work to do. If we know that, I guarantee you God also knows that. And so the worry that we have over our own child, that now that they can walk and run, we don't let them go outside, right? We keep them in, away from the street. We shelter them so that they're safe. How much more is God wanting to do that with us and to keep us safe? This chapter this week in Hosea, if you read it, it teaches us about that kind of love. So let's read that together. Hosea 11, verses 1 through 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. But the more I called to him, the farther he moved from me, offering sacrifices to the images of Baal and burning incense to idols. I myself taught Israel how to walk, leading him along by the hand. But he doesn't know or even care that it was I who took care of him. I led Israel along with my ropes of kindness and love. I lifted the yoke from his neck, and I myself stooped to feed him. But since my people refuse to turn to me, they will return to Egypt and will be forced to serve Assyria. War will swirl through their cities. Their enemies will crash through their gates. They will destroy them, trapping them in their own evil plans. For my people are determined to desert me. They call me the Most High, but they don't truly honor me. Oh, how can I give you up, Israel? How can I let you go? How can I destroy you like Admah or demolish you like Zeboim? My heart is torn within me, and my compassion overflows. No, I will not unleash my fierce anger. I will not completely destroy Israel, for I am God and not a mere mortal. I am the Holy One living among you, and I will not come to destroy. For someday the people will follow me. I, the Lord, will roar like a lion. And when I roar, my people will return trembling from the west. Like a flock of birds, they will come from Egypt, trembling like doves, they will return from Assyria. And I will bring them home again, says the Lord. It's a beautiful, beautiful poetic passage here that we're talking about. And to truly kind of get into the context of what's going on here, to talk about God's love in this chapter, we need to understand who Hosea is and his family. And if you know anything about Hosea, you know it's a really interesting story that is Hosea's. So to understand this context that he's talking about with God's love, let's talk about him for a minute. He was a prophet in the 8th century in the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, let's remind ourselves quickly, the northern kingdom of Israel, that's the kingdom that we've talked about the last couple of weeks. Okay? That's the kingdom that we talked about from Ahab and Jezebel last week, right? That's the kingdom we talked about of Jeroboam's from a couple of weeks ago, who established these golden calves at Dan and Bethel, right? Of leading the people astray. We're a couple hundred years almost since the time of Jeroboam, maybe about 100 years since the time of Ahab, and the people are still ensconced in this sin. They're still captured by the lure of evil in their midst. They can't break away from these idols. And we saw it here in Hosea's words. That sin has continued to lead the northern kingdom astray. And Hosea said a lot about it in his writings. Hosea's life, his family life, is really fascinating and difficult. Some of you probably know that he married a prostitute at the Lord's command. Yes, God himself told Hosea to marry a prostitute. Then he allowed his prostitute wife to go and do what prostitutes do. Well, he's left at home to try to raise his children alone. Because he did have 3 children with his wife, and all of them received interesting names. 2 names in particular that really stick out. His second child was named Lo Ruhamah, which literally translated means not loved. And I want you to imagine that for a moment. Imagine that you have one of your children and you call them not loved. What gets embedded in their psyche from that name? What does that communicate to them? And God specifically tells him, this is about my people. You have named your child what I am naming the people of Israel. What is God trying to communicate to his people? The third name, or the name of the third child rather, is Lo Ami, which literally means not my people. So now not only are they not loved, they are no longer the Lord's people. If you didn't think names were important before, you should now. These are not the names that we would name our children. Right? If I had named my third daughter, not my child, that would be communicating something very strong to the world, right? I don't want this kid. I do want my kid. Right? I'm just saying, if I hadn't done that. It's a very harsh sort of thing that we read here in Hosea in chapter 1. Then, of course, chapter 2 comes along. And he is instructed to rename his children. So in Hebrew, that word lo at the beginning means not. And so Hosea is instructed to drop that from both of their names. So now, instead of not loved and not my people, his children are now renamed to loved one and my people. So as you can see, Hosea's personal life had deep and abiding reflections into his ministry. Hosea's own parental experiences helped him understand God in new ways and to express, I think, what he does here in chapter 11. His acceptance of God's call on his life and his follow-through on the instructions that God has given him are really remarkable. I mean, to do what he did is really remarkable. Would that we all followed God with the same resolve and faithfulness. The second thing I want to talk about is how chapter 11 is kind of divided into 4 parts here. In the first part of this chapter, Hosea emphasizes God's calling his son out of Egypt. Now, it's possible that as we read that, or as you read it this week, you might have noticed a connection there. We're going to talk about that here in a minute, because there is a connection to the New Testament. Hosea makes it very clear in these first 4 verses that God is the primary actor on the scene. The emphasis here is all about what the parent has done and is doing for the child. These verses are dominated with I statements. The Lord is speaking through Hosea and stating I all over the place. He speaks directly to his people through the prophet. And so we see that God clearly views Israel as a child. And just as any parent gets frustrated with their children, there's not a parent who has never gotten frustrated with their children. It's impossible. It's literally impossible. And we all know it. It's literally impossible. God gets frustrated with us too. We know that. God gets frustrated with us too. But there's also love, right? The other really important thing to point out from these first 4 verses, as I said, is there is a New Testament connection. Some of you probably remember it. It comes from Matthew chapter 2. In Matthew chapter 1, we know what happens. There's this long genealogy, right? And then we don't ever make it past that because genealogies are terrible, and we don't want to read genealogies. Well, there's actually more beyond that genealogy. Jesus is born, right? This momentous occasion of Jesus' birth. Except there's a lot of turmoil around Jesus' birth. I'll put a plug in for my class downstairs. We're going to talk about that this morning in class downstairs, but I digress. So, after Jesus' birth, Herod's on the scene. What does Herod want to do? He wants to kill the little boy Jesus. So what did Joseph and Mary do with Jesus? They fled to Egypt. They became refugees in another country. They sought refuge in a place that's not their home because there was nothing else they could do except get out of the way. And so they went down to Egypt. And in chapter 2, upon their return, Matthew quotes here from Hosea 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, Hosea is talking about Israel, right? But Matthew takes this prophecy and says, but it has another fulfillment. It has another fulfillment in Jesus. And that's one of the beautiful and often daunting things about prophecy is trying to understand what are they talking about? What's really going on here? It can mean one thing for the Israelites, and then the New Testament writers can come along and say, now it means something else for us. And that's exactly what happens here with Hosea 11. In the second part of this chapter, Hosea switches tone. There's a very accusatory sort of tone in the voice of God to what he says after this. Instead of I statements, there are a bunch of they statements. They turned away from me. They will go into exile once again. God is now literally pointing the finger at them. They are to blame. He also mentioned Egypt here as a place that they would go. Well, they weren't actually taken into captivity into Egypt. The people of Israel weren't. They actually went into captivity into Assyria. Many of them did flee to Egypt, again, as Jesus did with his parents. But I think what Hosea is actually doing here, instead of this being the literal place to which they are taken into captivity, Egypt is this representation of slavery and bondage. Egypt is the representation for the people of Israel of hardship and distress and worry and angst and anger and fear and frustration and all these sorts of feelings, that's what Egypt reminds the people of, because they have a long memory. And over again, every Sabbath, as they gather to worship, they hear read to them, "The Lord brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery." And so for Hosea to remind the people here of that time, he's saying what's coming is like what happened when you went to Egypt. The third part of this chapter revolves around the loving parent imagery that we've begun to talk about. Once again, there's a switch back to the I statements. And in those I statements, we actually see the Lord agonize over His people. He agonizes for His people. This is a rhetorical question, but how many of you have agonized over somebody in your life? How many of you have agonized over your own children? Or another close family member of some kind, or a close friend? You agonize because you see the choices they're making. And you know that what they're doing can only lead to harm and not good for them and for other people. And so really, the only choice is to agonize over them. You can't force them to do what you want them to do. That's the same emotion and feeling that God has over His people. This picture of God's love is beautiful. It's full, it's rich, and it has depth and meaning to it. And then the final part of this chapter is about the return home. The Lord will put out the clarion call of the roar of a lion, and His people will respond and return home to Him. There's no greater rejoicing for God than when children return home. Nothing can put a smile on God's face more than a child choosing once again to follow and listen and to accept and receive God's abundant love. And I think we see that picture no more clearly, no more perfectly than in Jesus Himself, right? But also in this beautiful parable that He gives in Luke chapter 15. The story of the wayward sons. This one son who's given his father's inheritance, not because he had earned it, but because he wanted it, because he chose to take it. He left home, squandered it all in ridiculously wild living. And when he was at his utter end, the only choice he could make was to attempt to return home, but not as a son, as a servant. What did we see the Father do? Run to Him, embrace Him, call Him Son once again, and clothe Him richly. There's no more better picture of God's love than in that parable, I think. Maybe Hosea didn't have that in mind when he wrote this down, but that's what he's talking about. That's the God that he's talking about in Hosea chapter 11. Because as far away as you can be from God, as dirty as you can feel, as tired as you are, as messed up as you can be, as unforgivable as you think and feel you are, you're not. I mean, you may be all those things, but you're not to God. That's the beautiful, wonderful, outrageous, crazy thing about God's love. And so there are two reflections of God's love that I want to close out by talking about here. One of them is on display in this chapter, and that is that parental love. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. But all throughout Scripture, God is also described, or our relationship with God is also described as a marriage covenant. The love that a husband and wife feel, I mean, it's so different than any other sort of love, right? It's so richer and more powerful than any other sort of love. because marriage is about singular devotion. That's the kind of love that God has toward us, singularly focused on us. Marriage is about putting the other person first. That's the kind of love that God has toward us. Marriage is about forgiving the fact that your spouse snores and keeps you awake when you really want to go to sleep. That's the love that God has toward us. I'm the snorer, by the way. I want to make that clear. God's love for us is a crazy love. It's a crazy love. It's an indescribable sort of love. It just doesn't make sense. And I love that Hosea tries to here. And then there's the love of parents. Being a parent is risky. Right? It's a risky sort of thing. To raise a child? To have the audacity to think that you know what it takes to raise and care for a child, that's risky. When your children grow, they're really weird, right? Children do weird things. They walk funny because their motor skills are not refined yet. And so they fall down a lot, don't they? And then they cry. And you got to comfort them. You got to make them feel better. And your heart breaks to watch it happen. Or normal people, your heart breaks to watch it happen. If you're like me, you just say, get up and try again, right? Your children are going to get hurt. We know that. Children are going to get hurt. And they're going to hurt others. They may even hurt you. It's risky being a parent. And God risked everything for us. Because that's what parents do. You risk everything for your children. Because you want everything for your children. That's precisely what God wanted for us. And He risked it all in sending His own Son. And sometimes children even rebel against us, right? They stop listening to us. Those pesky children. They no longer think that you know it all and can provide all the answers. Hello, parents of teenagers. Right? They stop listening to you. They turn their backs on you and may even reject the very foundational wisdom with which you help them build their lives. God's children turn their backs on Him every single day. And yet, just like we do with our own children in remaining faithful to them, the crazy love of God is even more faithful to us than we could ever be to our own children. It's risky being a parent. And then there's the saying, this is going to hurt me a lot more than it hurts you. And don't act like you haven't said that to your children before, because you have. This is going to hurt me a lot more than it hurts you. We know that phrase, right? Because part of parenting means disciplining your children. It means punishing bad behavior. It means taking care of them like you know you're supposed to take care of them. Parenting means telling your children no when it's appropriate. God has to discipline us all the time. And so that phrase, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, quite literally applied to Him a billion times more than it could, there's not really a number to put there. Way more than it could ever apply to us. Because God literally sacrificed His Son on behalf of people who are going to reject Him and never follow what He wants them to do. Being a parent is risky. God risked it all. In verse 4, it says, God says, I myself stooped down or bent down to feed them, to take care of them. The Lord bent down. It doesn't say, I stood toweringly over my children and told them what to do and they listened to me. No, he bent down. Have you ever seen an adult do that? A child is scared. and an adult get down on their knees and look the child in the face and reassure them, you're going to be okay. Right? We're going to get through this. That's what I imagined as I read this. That God getting down on His knees and just wrapping His arms around me, around us, and saying, it's going to be okay. The Lord got down on our level. And He did that in no greater way than in Jesus. We see this truth of God's parental, crazy love no more than in the person of Jesus. God's enduring parental love is on display in this chapter. I got to tell you, it's a beautiful sight to behold. So to close out today, just a couple of takeaways. The first, are you willing, like Hosea was? Are you willing to follow God no matter what may be asked of you? And God may be asking a lot. Jesus certainly asked a lot of the rich young ruler to give away all that he had so that he could follow Jesus. It's possible that God may be asking a lot of you. Are you willing to do whatever it is God is asking of you? And then the final thing is, do you really believe in this crazy love that God has? Because if you do, then it changes you. The same way that as we experienced the love that our parents had toward us, the same way that we've given our love to children and grandchildren and friends and family and other people, it changes those people to experience that kind of love. It doesn't mean that everybody accepts it. Boy, do we want that. Does God want that? It doesn't mean that everybody accepts it. But it can change people. The crazy love of God can change you. Do you really believe that God's love is that crazy for you? Because it is. I really love this chapter in Hosea. It teaches us about God's love. And of course, as I said, we see that perfectly in Jesus. His life modeled that perfectly. But here it is in Hosea, hundreds of years before, saying, this is the kind of love that God has for you. I hope this morning that you feel that. I hope this morning that you experience that. I hope this morning that you're on the lookout for God's love for you and that it changes who you are. We're going to have a time here where we're going to sing and have the opportunity to pray for you, to love on you, to take care of you in the ways that we can. And we want to give that to you. We don't do it perfectly, but we want to do that for you. If you have needs that you want to bring before us, thanksgivings that you want to let this congregation know about so that we can rejoice with you, because that's part of what we need to do as well, as rejoice with each other. We want to do that for you this morning. So if you have any need that you want to bring before us, do so as we stand and sing.